Imagine for a moment that you've just stepped off of a time machine. All of a sudden, you find yourself surrounded by people with huge perms and ferret faucet hairstyles, wearing infamous jackets with those huge shoulder pads, and off in the distance, you think you hear the hum of Bon Jovi playing. You realize pretty quickly that you're not in 2015 anymore. The 1980s could be described as a decade of transitions. At this time, disco was dying out and new age music was coming in. Technology was beginning to take over people's lives, and more women were going back to work. In this speech, I will shed light on the major 1980s popular culture trends through my mother's, Tracy Moydell's, eyes, including some of her experiences of the social and political happenings during this time, as well as some of the biggest differences and similarities between the 1980s and today. In 1980, my mom had just graduated from high school in Montrose, Colorado. Having grown up on a farm, she wanted to travel the world and decided to join Up With People, a traveling performing group. She traveled in Europe for much of the early 1980s, and as a group, they performed many different kinds of music, including disco, folk, and songs and dances from the 1920s and the 1950s. While doing promotions for Up With People, she told me a story about how she remembered having to go to these pirate radio stations. I guess in Europe back then, they didn't let people listen to certain kinds of music, and they controlled what you could hear and not hear on the radio. So these pirate stations were a way to listen to the music they wanted to listen to. I thought that was pretty interesting. She also remembers while in Europe getting the news that President Ronald Reagan had been shot. She remembers everyone being really devastated. She also said that for the most part, people really liked Ronald Reagan because he was an incredible people person and was very charismatic. After touring in Europe, my mother returned to the States where she attended Western State College for a year. After that, she decided to rejoin Up With People and moved to San Diego, California to work at SeaWorld. While at SeaWorld, I asked her if it was as controversial then as it is today. She said that she does not remember SeaWorld being controversial back then or nearly as much as it is today. She said it was a wonderful experience. After her time with Up With People, where she ended up meeting my dad and then getting married, my mother got a job with Video Logic, where she was a receptionist and administrative assistant. After her time there, that led to a job with Rome Corporation, which was then bought out by IBM. When I asked her what it was like to be a woman in the workforce in California in the 1980s, she said that a lot of women at this time were going back to work, and it was common for them to leave their children at daycare. She also said that she had two female bosses, both of which had gone to really great colleges, Stanford and Harvard. And she said that although women still did not get equal pay for equal work, she remembers women being relevant in the office and getting promoted regularly to higher level positions. Although perms, ferret faucet hairdos, and shoulder pads are no longer in style, there are several differences and other similarities between growing up in the 1980s versus growing up in today's world. One thing we talked about was how cable television and technology are now at the center of our lives. This was just beginning to happen in the 1980s with the development of MTV and cable television. Although my mother did not watch MTV or a lot of television at the time, she remembers it being really important to people. We also talked about how exciting it was for her in the 1980s to get her car phone. She described it as being literally the size of like a box and the normal size of a phone that you would find like on a wall in a house. She said it's crazy today that we have such little cell phones. We also discussed how personal computers, although they had come out in the 80s, weren't really popular until later on when internet and things like that became more relevant. We did talk about how she liked the intimacy of the 80s better than what's going on in today's society. She said that although we have a lot more access to information and things like that, we're often disconnected from one another, and she misses the days when you could call someone on the phone and just talk to them about their day. She really misses the closeness that human beings used to have in the 1980s. In one word, my mother, Tracy Moydell, describes the 80s as being a time of enlightenment for her. Her experiences traveling around the country and around the world provided her with memories to last a lifetime. and many of her fondest memories occurred during the 1980s. Today I've shed light on the major 1980s popular culture trends through my mother's eyes, including some of the social and political happenings, as well as some of the biggest differences and similarities between the 1980s and today. Although the times have changed, and the pace of life continues to increase drastically year by year, we can look back at past decades to learn and grow as we move forward. The 80s were a time of transition, and as we continually transition into new eras in our own lives, it is comforting to know that regardless of what decade we are in, human beings still yearn for adventure, love, and enlightenment. Thank you.